Hi, everyone. I wanted to touch base this week and go over a few of the concepts that I think were really important to discuss over the last few chapters that we've covered. I know a couple weeks ago you all saw my interview with Marcus Grant, um, and last week you all saw my interview with Patrick Claybon, but there were a few things I wanted to discuss, particularly from last week and then a couple of the chapters from this week. First of all, last week we covered innovation. And I think that's one aspect of sports in general, but specifically sports leadership that often gets kind of brushed to the side because for some reason there's some folks who just ardently want to hold on to like this is what works and this is what's always worked, and we're not going to get away from that. And I think one of the easiest ways to see that across multiple sports is the use of analytics. Right, we've seen it with baseball, we've seen basketball pick it up, and more recently the NFL has been picking up analytics, trying to figure out, what is your best probability given a given play to either go for it on fourth down or not. But there was a lot of pushback from all those different sports leagues in implementing that innovation, right? Because there seems to be this thought process that like, well, it is just a sport that people play and it's reliant heavily on people, and we don't need people coming in here and trying to add math to what we're doing. Or it's really just an antiquated way of thinking about the goals that you're trying to reach, right? I think in any industry, you should be looking for ways to get creative, any way that you can get a slight edge on your opponent. And I think, particularly in sports, trying to get to know your team members well enough to know how you can take advantage of some of their skills, some of their talents. In one of my lectures I give in my leadership communication class, I talk about the fact that there is particularly, I always refer back to the NFL since football is my favorite sport, but a lot of tight ends in the league are former basketball players, NCAA basketball players, because coaches will look at someone's athletic ability and their natural talent and their size and their speed and say, hey, I know you never did this before, but you have a lot of the traits that I'm looking for that I can't coach up, right? I can't coach someone to be 6'4", 250 pounds and run a 4.6 40. But I can teach you how to run a route. I can teach you how to block a little bit. And little innovations like that, understanding that there are some people that might be better at things than others. You see it all the time when it comes to coaching and GMs and drafting. You see it sometimes even in local sports when they might use different players specifically for their strengths and maybe pull them off the court or pull them off the field in other circumstances. But that data-driven analytics is a perfect example of kind of the push and pull that goes on when innovation happens. I know I'm using that specific one as an example, but anytime people in your industry try to innovate, it's always going to get some pushback. And it is incumbent on you to, one, do your own research, right? To understand what are the costs and benefits, what are the potential advantages, what are the potential kind of drawbacks to what's going to happen with this type of innovation. So innovation is important. I think it's a matter about how you approach it and understanding the potential consequences and the potential benefits of implementing that innovation. Moving on, I want to talk about groupthink from this week, right? Because when it comes to decision making, sports is very much like any other industry, right? There, you can clearly see that there's a chart and a way that power moves in any particular industry. And with sports, it's a little bit different, right? You have the fans, or you have the players who answer to captains who answer to position coaches, position coaches who answer to the head coach. They often, they look towards the athletic director and they answer to the athletic director or to a GM. Locally, you think about the principal or the dean. And then when you think about these professional sports teams, you think about the owner. And it's a little bit different when you have an owner versus, when you're at the professional level versus to when you're at the local level and you're dealing with a principal, or maybe you even have the athletic director of the district. Where those folks are invested in that, it is their job to make sure things are running smoothly and no one's getting hurt, but also making sure that you are putting your schools and your teams in the best position to succeed. But then when you think about someone at the professional level who is an owner, not only are they thinking about those things, but And it's clear when you look at some of these owners in some of these leagues, their number one priority is making money, right? And then for many of them, it cuts off the incentive to do well, right? If you think about some of these teams or some of these owners who bought their teams decades ago for a few $1 million, and now these franchises are worth a couple $1 billion, they literally have not had to do much of anything to build these empires by purchasing these franchises. But there is still that idea of there's multiple players with multiple goals. And I'm not using players like the actual sports players. I'm thinking about the different players involved within that organization. Like I just said, coaches, players, and all of those still answering to the fans in the local community. And so it's important that when you're trying to make these decisions as someone who's in a position of power, that you, of course, try to bring in as many voices as possible. I think one of the things that many leaders often get wrong is that their way is the only way that's going to succeed. I think a big part of understanding or a big part of knowing what leadership should be, and a big part of what being a good leader is understanding what you know, and more importantly, understanding what you don't know, right? Knowing when you need to bring people in, knowing when someone who may be good at one thing or someone whose specialty may be one thing can still contribute, even if the decision that's being made is on something radically different, right? Because they might be able to approach that from an angle that you might not even be able to think about. So I think understanding those things is critically important. And as a leader, you have to optimize. I talk about this in the book. You have to optimize a combination of task management and people management, right? Because you're getting hired on in a particular position and you have multiple responsibilities, right? You have your own responsibilities in terms of like what position you hold, right? Your day-to-day stuff. But you're also in charge of keeping the synergy of the organization. And that's the synergy amongst the players, synergy amongst the coaches, and the synergy around the whole organization, depending on, what position you're at. That's a lot of responsibility. And oftentimes there's too many people who think that they have to do everything themselves and don't understand the importance of building that tree out, right? Coaching up the coaches, right? Being a role model to them, but also giving them the autonomy to lead in their own way, as long as they understand what the overall goal of the organization is. So in terms of the book talks about the conditions for team effectiveness. They talk about you should have a real team. You should be heading in a compelling direction, right? You need to make sure those goals are clear to everybody in the organization. You should have an enabling structure, right? Good size, skills, cohesion, supportive organizational context, right? Thinking about the rewards that are available for coaches and for players. And the other thing is information, right? I think just from the research I've done in terms of the kind of decision making going from owner to GM or the person who's in charge of player personnel to coaching, I can't tell you how many times you see a failure coming from like a team's roster because those three individuals or however many individuals are involved aren't on the same page and aren't sharing the same information. You've seen situations where a team is drafted, has already done their draft for the year for whatever rookies that they're going to sign, and they're in between general managers, and the new general manager is going off of the player evaluations from the person before, right? That clearly, if you have a GM who is bringing players onto a team without consulting a coach, I mean, that's two different types of information. You might be bringing players along who have no real role and don't fit the system that the coach may want to implement. A lot of that comes down to communication. A lot of that comes down in creating avenues for communication. And expert coaching, and like I said, that doesn't only include coaches coaching players. That means, folks in admin in the front office coaching amongst themselves and them coaching the coaches and then coaches coaching the players, right? Like coaching happens on multiple levels and in ensuring that success is happening. And lastly, I want to talk about the chapter on sports for development and peace organizations, because I think it's easy to talk about some of these organizations that are built for that specific purpose, right? They talk about the GP in Brazil and how they got essentially a lot of the folks in the community to start conversations about gender. They talked about goals in Haiti. But I think a lot of that from the chapter, at least in my opinion, I think it would be disingenuous not to talk about the ability for coaches and for leaders in the sports industry to be able to have goals like this regardless of what the organization is or the purpose of the organization. Right? We see this all the time with professional sports leagues. We see this with just on an individual player basis where, yes, I'm successful at this sport, or yes, this team is successful, but this is what we're doing in terms of community outreach. And a lot of that, not a lot of it, but some of that is absolutely going to be done for PR. But I think if you are in a position where you can make some of these decisions, you can make it to where it's not just about making sure we're getting good PR, that you're actually having multiple goals within your organization, right? We see this all the time on in other industries. We have like forgetting the name of the company, but or like Tom's shoes, right? Tom's, you order a pair of shoes, and for every pair you buy, they provide shoes to someone in need, right? Where that is part and parcel with what the organization does. And I think in terms of leadership and what you're doing with your organization, you can try to implement things like that. And they talk about some of the skills needed for people in this type of position or people who want to do that. And I think it's really important. And it's something that I kind of jotted down because I think it's something that's not just relevant for folks who are doing these sports for development and peace organizations, right? They talk about caring deeply about people, possessing a deep commitment to equity, and understanding of the systemic barriers to equity, and being able to operate with few resources while also being adept at developing multiple sources of funding. That's a lot, right? That's understanding that there are bigger things than you going on, understanding the different identities of your players, of your staff, of your community, understanding what barriers that they may have to face that you never even really have to think about, but also understanding the different ways that you need to provide funding for your organization to keep operating. And when they talk about some of these organizations, I think specifically when you talk about whether you're at the local level or the national or the professional level, like knowing the strengths and the weaknesses and the preferences of your players, and also balancing that in terms of what the team needs, what the organization needs, and just understanding that all of this, whether it's an organization built specifically like these sports for development and peace organizations, or whether it is just any other sports organization, that often the only way that you're going to be able to succeed in these practices is with strategic decision making, right? Understanding that there should be purpose, that there should be this overarching goal and purpose of the organization that you're striving towards, and that all the minor decisions that are happening underneath that umbrella are still pushing you closer to your goal. So that's what I want to talk to you all about today. I know a few of you all are still working on your paper, so if you have questions, please do not hesitate to call or text or email. I am still I'm still activating my phone or turning on the Skype app for my office hours. I just talked to someone in class today about their final paper. So if you have questions, please make sure to reach out. But yeah, that's our lecture for this week.